Hi, everyone, and welcome to another webinar in our summer webinar series. I have the pleasure to introduce Dr. Arya Thampuran. She's an assistant professor in Black Health and the Humanities at the Institute for Medical Humanities, Durham University. She's also the principal investigator on the Wellcome Trust-funded Black Health and the Humanities Network, and co-leader of the new NNMHR-funded Neurodivergent Humanities Network. Her research is broadly situated at the intersection of the medical humanities and critical race studies. She is interested in how creative practitioners in contemporary African diasporic context express distress and healing in ways that exceed dominant Euro-American biomedical models and disrupt clinical framings of distress as disorder. Her research draws on multimodal corpus of fiction, life writing, visual art, television, and film in by contemporary African creatives to explore how representations of distress might re-script prevailing psychiatric narratives of illness and wellness. Principally, her work is committed to a decolonial and intersectional approach, bridging interdisciplinary perspectives across the medical humanities, critical race, literary, and neurodiversity studies. In her current roles within these networks, Arya is working to facilitate critical conversations and interventions in decolonizing healthcare research and provide support for scholars or practitioners in this field, drawing on the range of disciplinary expertise and interest across medical humanities research communities and communities of lived experience. Very welcome, Dr. Thampuran.
Thank you, Arya, and thank you, Arya, Sophie, and Curtis, for inviting me to be part of this great seminar series. It's really an honor and a privilege to be part of this and to be in dialogue with this lovely community. This afternoon, I'm actually going to be reflecting a bit on my veering from literary studies into the critical medical humanities, and something that I feel is really a methodological sort of linchpin or connection point between literature and science, or literature and the medical humanities as I see it, which is a methodology of care, and how the idea of an ethics of care can sort of bridge different disciplines together, and how that has sort of expressed itself through my work or through the different spaces that I've had the privilege of being part of. So I'm just going to try and grapple with technology here for a bit so that I can share my screen. Is that working for everyone? Okay, brilliant.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'd like particularly to reflect on how the term care has come to circulate in research spaces in the way that we handle not just material, but research communities or research ecologies, particularly when the material that we handle has intimate personal resonance with our own lived experience. And again, I feel like this is one of the really critical questions that we ask ourselves in the medical humanities, and how we can attend to these expressions within literary studies and develop or formulate a way of attending to these questions. So I'd also really love to invite reflections on some of my provocations and really see this as a space, not so much of me sort of telling you how I've developed a methodology, because I haven't, spoiler alert, but see it as a space to sort of work through rather than work out some of these really sticky questions that I'm thinking about. So my research is situated within critical race studies and the medical humanities. So as Arya explained, I'm interested in how we might ethically engage with questions of mental health and think about expressions of distress and healing through individual bodies, but also bodies of knowledges in ways that sort of exceed dominant clinical schemas and frameworks. I'm interested in what the body can tell us about illness and wellness that goes beyond that biomedical schema, and also then interrogating the prototype for the healthy normative body in a Western scientific rationality. So I'm interested then in how we might be decontextualizing or even depoliticizing the experience of distress by bringing these experiences of illness and wellness purely into the realm of the biomedical, or purely through a biological prism, by reading for diagnosis, for example. So sometimes often when we encounter literary work and we see particularly like in the contemporary moment when we read retrospectively, there is a tendency to sort of identify within characters certain traits or behaviors that we might code psychiatrically through sort of knowledge schemas that we have now. But how can we sort of think about it a little bit more differently and think about it through knowledge systems that aren't canonical, I suppose, through Western lenses of reading or even through a Western curriculum? So to me, this is fundamentally a decolonial act, reclaiming the validity and the value of racialized bodies and also bodies of knowledge that have been historically devalued or cast as other by colonial knowledge power dynamics, and a scientific rationality that entrenches this sort of dualism, so us versus them, that mind-body dualism as well, that sort of sees one particular body of knowledge as being superior to another, or even pitting entire schemas against each other, seeing them as being parts of being completely disparate or in disparate spheres. So spirituality versus superstition, or science versus culture or literature and the arts, for example. And the body has often been relegated as an inferior mode of knowledge. There is this sort of medicalized mistrust of the body. There's a prevailing sentiment also in schemas like the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual of Mental Disorders that people in developing countries, to quote the manual, tend to somatize their distress more. And this is almost sort of a value judgment on the inability to perhaps express it through a particular psychiatric language. But what can the body tell us? What can the body store as sort of its archival quality? What can it tell us about illness contextualized? Illness is something that is embodied and also environmentally expressed as well, environmentally embedded. And how do we then translate across these different disciplinary boundaries to really see the body as something that's unbounded almost? And to me, the next question that comes up is what happens to concepts like care and cure when certain bodies are differentially exposed to particular forms of epistemic erasure and environmental violence? So racialized bodies, bodies that occupy multiple marginalities because of race, sex, class, for example. And I see, as I said, care ethics as a methodological point of convergence between these different disciplines, and also a political act of redress, a way of reconceptualizing well-being and a way of reading the body that restores particular dignity to lived experience. So coming from a literary studies background, I don't know how many of us in the audience are from a literary studies background, we don't often think about methodological issues in our own positionality or situatedness in a text. We do often think about how structural factors can structure a text, so how race, sex, and class, for example, intersect to form certain themes, textual themes, or inform the way a text is shaped around genre, mode, medium. But again, with methodology, we don't often think perhaps about the ethics of witnessing a text, and ethics of reading the body as text, or our own situated encounter with the text, how our frames of reference, having been exposed to particular theoretical frameworks, acculturation, invite us to impose a certain frame of reference or medium of interpretation that might sit dissonantly with the text or the expressor of the text. I'm also thinking very keenly then about the kind of labor that narrative performs. How do we read just for experiential access? And what are the limits of perhaps empathy or understanding in that encounter? So I'm using the term attend to rather than read to demonstrate this unfolding or that embedding of this particular set of methodological considerations around care and the ethics of witnessing into that encounter. So rather than reading in sort of like top-down imposition, or perhaps that sense of extracting particular knowledges from a text, to really sort of be in an co-produced exchange or dialogue with that text, what could that look like? So by way of sort of demonstrating this, I really wanted to turn my attention and also to share a piece of performance art that really got me thinking about some of these questions a few years ago when I was doing my doctoral research. And it really profoundly also changed and shaped the direction of my research and the set of questions that I was asking. So this is Black British performance artist Heather Agyapong's The Body Remembers, which I had the privilege of watching when I was neck deep in my PhD write-up phase, right after the lockdown was lifted. So this is a piece of participatory performance art that's inspired by Agipong's practice of authentic movement. And authentic movement is a therapeutic modality that involves moving the body through impulse in order to release stress and tension. And in this piece, Agipong moves against the backdrop of an immersive soundscape. And the soundscape is an amalgamation of voices of Black British women who are expressing their testimonies of trauma and healing. And they're an interviewer in dialogue with Agipong. So as she moves, she's sort of channeling the voices of these women. And we are invited to participate in that inner space of them sort of recounting their experiences. And Agipong is framed as the mover and the audience as the witness, but there isn't so much that separation. There is this really immersive sense when I sort of participated as the witness as it's framed in that space. There's this collapse of boundaries between the performing body and the participating body. You're not so much witnessing, but being invited or drawn into the performance. So, for example, you're not separated from the stage, you're actually almost within the stage space. And that really got me thinking about what it means to not just witness and observe, but also to really feel that sense of immersion into experiences that might be similar or dissimilar from one's own. What then are the ethics of, participating in that? So here, Agipong draws on her personal experience of how post-traumatic stress disorder expresses itself somatically, often without conscious awareness of the trauma that one's body holds. So I'm just going to play the trailer so that there is a bit of there's a bit more a sense of immersion, I suppose, for the audience, and it's not just me trying to describe and not describing very well what's a really beautiful performance. So just checking that the sound is working. Yeah. Okay.
So I think it can be begun with palpitations and then these feelings of anger that I couldn't release.
Sorry, can everyone see and hear that?
We can only see your slide, Arya, so we can
okay.
hear it, but we can't. I think you have to share a different screen.
Okay, I'll share the performance screen.
That's perfect. But we can hear it perfectly, so that's great.
Okay. So
that's it. Perfect.
Perfect.
And so I think it can be begun with palpitations and then these feelings of anger that I couldn't release.
And I was like, I'm not making it up. I was literally shaking, sweating, headaches, palpitations, everything. So my body is just hurting. But like structurally, there's nothing wrong with it.
And I couldn't release in my relationships. But those were probably the sources of these things. And so they were just getting stored.
okay. So I'm just going to share my slides back again. Right. So I had the privilege of watching that performance, that incredibly moving performance, right after lockdown lifted. And I felt like I'd been writing this thesis, this doctoral work on expressions of mental health and distress in contemporary African diasporic contexts in a bit of an insular vacuum sometimes. It was just me and the text. It was me and a piece of visual art, for example, and particularly during the isolating sort of insular lockdown pandemic related PhD times, I suppose, that a lot of us could perhaps relate to. And watching this performance and that sense of collective care that was being displayed towards the audience. So there were props around, there were supportive materials, there were books, there were resources, there were tissues, there were soft toys, there were blankets. Really made me then think about what it means to hold space for things that are distressing and what it then means to extend care, not just towards the materials that we're working with, but also to the communities of practice, to the communities around us. Another thing that really struck me also was in spaces of collective trauma, what does it mean to embrace relationality while acknowledging one's positionality and the distinctness of one's positionality? So me participating as a woman of color, but not someone from a Black British background. And what does it then mean? What are the further set of implications there in me sort of speaking about or attesting to or attempting to represent this experience in writing? Because I was there very much to write about it as well. I wanted to write about it. I wanted to sort of analyze it, understand what this form of authentic movement could tell us. But what does it mean for me to be the sayer then in this context? So it made me also think then about my approach and how methodology has to evolve to sort of accommodate these questions and considerations. So this also leads me to some of the work that I'm doing with the Black Health and the Humanities Network, which Sophie, Curtis, and Arya had asked me to speak a little bit about. And it's, again, a real privilege to be working with this incredible network, cross-disciplinary, cross-sectoral community of artists, activists, and academics who are working at the intersection of Black health and the humanities. So the network was first established in 2020, and it was a training program that brought us all together from different disciplines to think about the issues that are confronting researchers from racialized and minoritized backgrounds, and also what are the main issues and sticking points in healthcare research. So what were the barriers to access in healthcare research, but also what were the gaps in researching communities that were being disproportionately affected in 2020 by the COVID-19 pandemic. But what also really, and the Black Lives Matter movement that had really created this mass conversation, this momentum for a conversation about these disproportionate and asymmetrical access to healthcare and also research. What really obviously came to the fore at that time was how some bodies were more valued than others, how some bodies of knowledge as well were more valued than others. And our workshops became a space for us to work through that. But also, some of us in that space had asymmetrical experiences or differential experiences and encounters with that firsthand as well. So it was a way of sort of thinking about the material we were engaging with that had a lot of personal resonance for some, and how then we could navigate issues of who should be speaking, who should be representing, and how we should be speaking about texts that aren't just sort of theoretical pieces of work, but that are also things that embody lived experience. And the language since, I suppose, the Black Lives Matter movement and the momentum that's been created since then around decoloniality has invited this language of safe spaces, inclusive spaces, and diverse spaces. But I really want here to also interrogate what those words actually mean in practice and what it means to sort of bring care into the equation, not just, again, for the content. So it's not just about sort of throwing out content warnings, but actually actively engaging with the process of redignifying the way in which we read, the way in which we relate to the texts. So principally, this methodology has been guided by an incredible scholar, Sabelo Ndlovu-Gatsheni, who remarks that if you remove colonialism physically without removing it epistemically, it will not disappear. And he offers the provocation that methodology, if not subjected to decolonial interrogation, carries the dirty history of colonialism and racism. To decolonize methodology itself means we have to think deeply about ethics. We must think about subject-to-subject relationship method and not the object-to-subject relationship. You must think of a non-extractive methodology. So what then does that mean for our encounter as reader with text if we were to reframe that from subject to subject, and really think about the expressor behind that text as well and holding space for that instead of just thinking about it as a piece of material, I suppose, that we're reading for meaning or that we're mining for meaning if we were to think of a non-extractive methodology. So in thinking about this, the decolonial, just to break down sort of that decolonial and intersectional approach, a decolonial approach means reading these expressions on their own terms to foreground the consumer, survivor, user experience and foreground voices that have historically and persistently been neglected or relegated to the margins, to have been relegated as other. And this involves recentering non-Eurocentric interpretive schemas, ways of understanding the world, understanding selfhood and relationality that are culturally salient and contextually meaningful. And this requires a displacement of the centrality and also the singularity of Western interpretive schemas, Western biomedical models or understandings of the self as being a self-enclosed or self-contained entity, the autonomous whole self or the healthy self that often is circulated in well-being discourse. And an intersectional schema and framework then would map the socio-political onto the aesthetic and formal dimensions of a text. So this is sensitivity to how structural inequalities structure the text and also structure our reading. So what kinds of frames of reference are we exposed to? What has become canonical? What has become, our main modes of access or entry into knowledge? And a qualifier here is that I sort of invoked that Enlightenment rationality, that duality or binary mode of thinking, that separation of science from spirituality or mind and body. And this kind of approach also tries to sidestep that duality by not positioning Afro-diasporic or non-West versus Western models of knowledge, but rather not to see them as counter-narratives as we sometimes do in literature, but to see them as co-produced knowledge or knowledges that are sort of mingling within or circulating within the same space, as is often the case in diasporic or migratory experiences. So this is an approach that decenters one model of knowledge that has enjoyed epistemic supersedence and hierarchy over something else, but does not dismiss Western epistemic modes, if that makes sense. It's not reproducing that binary or privileging one mode over the other. And this is also a mode of reading that sort of rather than attempt then to reorder the text through our familiar interpretive schemas, then this would be a way of seeking formal closure, seeking that sort of recovery narrative in texts that express distress. This would be to read them on their own terms and to be able to sit with irresolution, or not try and mine for meaning or mine for closure, but be okay or be okay with that sort of ability to hold polarities together as well. So I'd like to sort of unpack some of these methodological considerations and show how it can be put into practice through a text that has, again, really struck a chord with me and really informed the way I approach this sort of methodological concern of care in my work. And that is Selena Thompson's 2017 performance art piece, Salt. And this was another performance art piece that I encountered first through the Black Health and the Humanities Network workshops. And we really had to navigate also that sense of, within the space, some of us within that space having had quite intimate and quite personal encounters with some of the subject material that was being handled, and navigate those questions of how we treat this text, which we initially encountered in script form rather than in performance form, in a way that would dignify its expression and also be sensitive to the communities of practice that are still very intimately engaged with this. So Thompson's 2017 live art piece, Salt, tracks her own personal journey traveling through the Atlantic Triangle to recover ancestral histories of enslavement and work through deeply personal questions of identity. It's structurally divided into three main points of this diasporic route: Europe, Africa, specifically Ghana, and Jamaica. At each juncture, Thompson registers the enduring legacies of violence enacted against the Black female body. Structurally, Thompson taps into a journey motif, which some of us in literary studies would be all too familiar with, but radically redefines its trajectories and telos. Hers is a journey that rejects that narrative momentum towards closure or resolution. It's one that draws on that movement to establish connections, so connections with an ancestral past, with ancestral lands, and also with the audience now, creating that sort of community in order to heal, much like Arya does with that community space where she draws in these collective narratives and creates that tapestry. So it's not just a singular history of violence and distress that's being expressed here, but a tapestry, a collective one, a collective history that's often been buried, that's been invisibilized and silenced. So this also sort of flouts that logic of a Bildungsroman, for example, that narrative momentum towards growth, towards eventual self-realization and self-actualization. And Thompson really disrupts these ideas of closure, of self-actualization, by demonstrating how the violence that is wrought on particular racialized and minoritized communities are cyclical and persistent. So it's not simply a thing of the past, but sort of infects the present. And it's a way of also walking through what a future might look like through collective healing. So the mode of storytelling here very much draws on an Afro-diasporic oral tradition. So there is a tendency towards that cyclicality, circularity. So she repeats things multiple times. There is that cyclical structure. I can never say that word properly, cyclical structure in her narration as well, which is in keeping with the reincarnation cosmology in West African tradition, which Selena Thompson has her roots in. And in a poignant monologue at the first point, it's structurally divided into three. In Europe, Thompson lists every racist encounter she has experienced in different parts of England chronologically, from Brighton to Birmingham and Bristol, ending each anecdote with the refrain, "Europe pushes against me, I push back." And Thompson is accompanied by a filmmaker on her voyage, and she is sort of victim to his really misogynistic behavior and his very racist behavior as well. And this is something that she documents in the text. So along her journey, she says that she grows accustomed to a timeline, an endless feed of Black pain, Black rage, and Black people having to assert that Black lives matter because Black death is the norm. The aberration, the deviation from the norm is refusing that. So again, coming at this really poignant moment when we read this together as a network in 2020, when the Black Lives Matter movement was gaining momentum, and thinking through these questions of what it means to witness, what it means to spectate, again, the spectacle of Black death and what it means for these images of violence to be reproduced the way they are, and what that means in terms of sort of in terms of awareness raising on one hand, but on the other, a mode of sort of re-traumatizing for many on the other. How then do we sit with that and work through those difficult questions of what it means to reproduce these images of pain? And I would really I don't have much time to go into Saidiya Hartman's work on the reproduction of images of enslavement, but I would really recommend Saidiya Hartman's work on this because she has some really valuable provocations on what it means to ethically handle content that has to do with enslavement. So the sense of living in a never-ending apocalypse, which is a really striking metaphor that Thompson uses, draws back to that idea of cyclicality of violence, how there is a sense of persistent, that temporality of death, that temporality of that foreclosure of a future or future orientation at all. So she makes a really powerful case for redefining the poetics and the politics of healing here. Healing then has to necessarily be structured around something that's open-ended, that's non-linear, when there is no end in sight to that violence. And I'm using the term healing instead of cure here to avoid that biomedicalized valence of the term cure, and also more crucially to avoid reinforcing that sense of self-contained linear temporality, that there is a point of distress that moves straight into cure, but rather this is something that needs to be worked out repeatedly with different audiences, with different communities in Thompson's healing space. So her entire theatre space then becomes a space to bring the community together to participate through ritual in this process of healing. So before the performance begins, the woman, who's played by Selena Thompson and later Rochelle Rose at the Royal Court Theatre, prepares the material she needs for her storytelling, from a sledgehammer to salt and libations, and performs the ritual cleansing of the space. And Thompson refers to her body as this body. It's also a collective body. It's a body of knowledge. It's a body of stored memory of ancestral histories. It's a composite collection rather than a singular, autonomous, or whole body, as is imagined sort of in wellness culture. The woman is also every woman, and she's not speaking so much for a group, but from within a group. And Thompson here is drawing again on Afro-diasporic oral tradition here to bring the audience into the fold and use ritual as a mode of bringing back knowledge systems and practices that have sort of been devalued in healing spaces. And cathartically, she breaks open a salt rock, symbolic of Europe, and she then disseminates this salt rock to everyone in the audience to bring back with them as a piece of the performance, as a signifier of that healing space, and also tells people to hold on to that space. And really strikingly, before parting with the salt rock, she tells the audience to sit with it, sit with the pain. It doesn't go away, but we are sitting with you, that collective we, signifying how she has enmeshed these different communities together in one space. To come together, there is that need to deconstruct, to smash open that quite raw pain, that collective trauma, that burden that's signified by the big rock. To reconstruct in order to repair, and to deconstruct in order to reconstruct, to repair, to rebuild. And that symbolic salt then that each audience member comes away with signifies that process of open-ended healing, that sense that this is something that has to be taken outside of the theatre space for redress. So the act of sitting with here is not so much stagnation. It's an interruption of the progress or resolution arc, that momentum. It's an interruption or disruption of that momentum towards closure. But it is also radically restorative, also productive against that neoliberal orientation towards wellness, towards wholeness. It's forcing us to reckon with or confront the way there can be no wellness or wholeness for as long as those systems and structures are still in, those sort of distressing systems and structures are still in place. And at the intersection of art and activism, then, what I see Thompson and Agyapong really doing then is to enfold this practice of care, which often capitalist theatre structures are at odds with, practices, making it a communal effort. Thompson has often spoken about the labor that the performing body has to stressful for sort of education and awareness for theatre spectators. And she really pushes back against this and draws quite a firm line about who should be witnessing, who should be speaking for. And I just wanted to end here by really thinking then about this concept of sitting with and being able to dwell in that irresolution and dwell in that sense of disorder and not see it as something pathological, but something generative and productive. But also what then it means to draw into a space text that can invoke that quality of distress, that quality of sort of unsettling when it disrupts our familiar modes and frames for encountering something, and what it means to allow us to think differently, think a bit more expansively, but also think with care and handle materials, handle the people that we're thinking through these with care as well. So I really invite your reflections to these provocations as well in the question and answer session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Arya Thampuran. I would like to express my sincerest appreciation. I really enjoyed your lucid, well-structured presentation, especially the way your research is situated at the intersection of the medical humanities and critical race studies. Thank you very much.